Thank you. Have you met my agent? This is an introduction that requires no speaker. Well, thank you for being here. 2018, 150 years since the birth of this extraordinary Scottish genius, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the direct contemporary of an equally important American genius, Frank Lloyd Wright, born 1 year apart. But what an extraordinarily different life they led. All of Mackintosh's work in Scotland is compressed into an active creative period of no more than 10 to 12 years. Whereas Frank Lloyd Wright lived on till the age of 92, designing buildings, designing interiors, everything you can think of, right to the last moment of his life. But what these two contemporaries did was to change the way that we think about architecture. Now, how interesting it is that in 2 weeks' time, you're going to have a geologist speaking about the tectonic plates in Scotland. I'm going to introduce you to a human tectonic plate. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who in his work moved mountains and made the world think an entirely different way about how architecture, design, and all the things that go in the plastic arts in the built environment, how they could be changed. He's a man of parts. They would say in Scotland, a lad of parts. It's hard to define him. He's an arts and crafts artist, architect, designer. There are overtones of the Art Nouveau of Europe, the Celtic Revival, a romantic nationalist who looked upon his own country as the source of new ideas, an early modernist, an artist, an architect, and a designer. Born and brought up just a few years from the turn of the century. Now think about being an artist, designer, and architect. You're born, you're brought up, you mature, you go to college, you attend the Glasgow School of Art, you train as a designer and architect, and you're thinking ahead to just a few years from now. The 19th century will be gone, and we enter the 20th century. What is the appropriate language for architecture and design and the arts as we enter this unknown territory? Well, that's what Mackintosh was asking. He was born with significant disabilities. He had a club foot. He was seriously dyslexic throughout his life. And he had, as you can see from this photograph, a turn in his eye. His weakness was commented upon by doctors quite early on in his life, and he was told to strengthen himself, to get out of the house. Probably a good idea. He had 8 siblings. Get out into the landscape and start walking and start drawing. And so with a small drawing tablet and a pen, he started to go out into the Scottish landscape and fell in love with the flora, the fauna, the castles, the architecture, the landscape of Scotland, because his family came from the Highlands of Scotland. Now, if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know what this is. This is Island Donan Castle on the west coast of Scotland, the kind of building that Mackintosh drew as a child walking in that landscape. One of the most romantic, powerful, iconic Scottish castles. But the family lived in the city of Glasgow, and Glasgow was really something. The second city of the British Empire, the main manufacturing base for locomotives, for railway track, and of course for ocean liners and warships, all built on the River Clyde, which led from the city of Glasgow directly west. This was a liquid superhighway that pointed directly at America, at Canada, at the West Indies, the places that they could import materials from. So it was coffee and tea and rice and sugarcane. And Glasgow became an enormous, powerful place, filled with immensely rich people, in contrast with slums that were said to be worse than Cathay in China. And if you lived in Glasgow at that time, and you were fortunate enough to be one of those wealthy few, then you lived in an environment that looked like this. This is a typical parlor room for a member of the middle to upper middle class in Glasgow. This looks exactly like the kind of parlor room that my grandmother had. It was a sort of marine obstacle course to get in and out of it. furniture everywhere. It was always overheated. There was a horrible parakeet that made loud noises, aspidistra plants behind which the cats had. That's the kind of place that Mackintosh would have seen as he went to visit his neighbors. Now, if you want the real contrast, this is it. Mackintosh didn't live in that. Mackintosh lived in this. So I would suggest that if you went today and bought a copy of Elle Decor or Architectural Digest, it'd be hard to tell that this is how he lived in 1896. Because when you look at contemporary design, when you watch HGTV, they're talking about simplicity, about the power of less is more, as Mies van der Rohe said. Mies van der Rohe, the great architect, said about Mackintosh, he was one of the purifiers of early modern architecture, stripping away all those historical references. But if he lived in Glasgow, he not only saw those overstuffed, overheated, frantic interiors, but also he was surrounded by architecture that looked like this. This was the style of architecture that affected everybody in Britain. It was nothing to do with Britain. Instead, there was revival after revival. And so this building was designed by a Glasgow architect from Scotland who didn't ever travel to the continent, but was building in this Athenian style. And his name was Alexander Thomson. He was so enamored of this that he was known as Alexander the Greek Thomson. And everything he built looked like this. So Mackintosh was completely surrounded by an architecture that had nothing to do with his own culture, nothing to do with Scotland. In fact, he had this lot to contend with. These are the revivals that were taking place around the turn of the century. So you have the Classicism, Greek and Roman, and the Gothic revival. Then you have Lombardic, which is sort of mad confection of Italian styles. Then you have Venetian. They loved Venetian. The Egyptian revival appeared everywhere. Drachenstyle, you may not be so familiar with this, but this is dragon-style architecture from Scandinavia. In other words, the kind of buildings that Vikings would have been happy in. National Romanticism, abroad everywhere in Europe, particularly in Hungary and in Finland, where people were looking back to that ancient form of design and architecture and trying to reclaim it. The Finns in particular. So if you look at the architecture of Eliel Saarinen and listen to the music of Sibelius, this is about reclaiming your national identity. Mackintosh was the leader in thinking about this. Then, of course, there was chinoiserie, that's the Chinese revival. And then one of my favorite words, turquoiserie, or arabisme, the Moorish revival that came from the discoveries that they had found in Egypt as they were going through, and the French were doing this too. And, of course, the overlaying power of Japonism, the fascination with the work that came from the Far East. And underlying all this, bubbling away quietly, was an extraordinary revolution about things that were uniquely British, the Celtic revival. What was uniquely Celtic about Scotland, about Wales, about the Isle of Man, about Ireland itself, and Cornwall, and Brittany on the north coast of France? All of these things were thrown together. So when Mackintosh walked out of his house in the morning and went to study at the Glasgow School of Art, he'd pass things like this. A Greek temple, photographed here on the only sunny day for 44 years, to make it look like it's in Athens, but it's not. Has nothing, and if you think that's mad, well, I told you they like the Venetians. How about this? This is a carpet factory in the middle of Glasgow, designed to be based on the Doge's palace. Yeah. Well, Mackintosh did something really quite wonderful. He did a 180-degree spin, and he turned away from that because all of these revival styles are Southern styles. They're Italian, they're French, they're Spanish, they're German. They're not to do with Scotland. They're not even to do with England. Mackintosh instead rejected all of that classical historicism, turned around and said, there is another source for the architecture of the next century, and this is it. He went back to look at the national architecture of Scotland. He went to look at the baronial mansions. He went to look at Dunnottar Castle, which is near Aberdeen. He went to look at clay pots. It's a wonderful little building, about 1590. He started to study these buildings and draw the architectural elements that you see here, the rounded tower, the almost random distribution of windows, crow-stepping on the gables, overstressed chimneys. He saw medieval buildings like this, done with fieldstone, covered with a stucco that the Scots call harling. And he went to some of the great houses and looked here at Blair Athol. Asymmetrical facade, asymmetrical layout of the windows, attached towers that don't match up. A way of building that was very much done from fieldstone and handcrafted. And he looked the other way into small houses and small workshops designed for cottage industries. These are weavers' cottages. So in order to maximize the use of the rooms, in order to put the looms in the rooms, they attach towers on the outside. And so the staircases going up and down are always on the outside of the building. And of course, being Scots, are never heated. Save every penny that you can. Mackintosh looked at this and drew these things and joined them together to create an entirely new way of looking at how you could build. And he did this while he was a student at Glasgow School of Art, where he met this extraordinary woman, Margaret MacDonald, and her sister, Frances MacDonald. And with Frances's boyfriend, became known as the Four. And they looked hard at how they thought they could have a new way of life. Well, Margaret, you see here sitting, wearing a dress, of course, of her own design, in a chair designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, with a panel set in the back of the chair, designed by Mackintosh. These people didn't go to Nordstrom Rack. Everything from your shoes to your hair had to be designed and worn in order to create a holistic lifestyle, in which every element of your life, the building that you were in, what you read, everything that was part of your life had to be created to design. We'll never know what they really look like, except that I think I have a pretty good idea. This is my friend Megan, who had a 24-inch waist, which must be the same size as Margaret's waist because she's wearing Margaret's dress. And she has the same color hair as Margaret. Waist-length, dark red auburn hair. And she's posed here in front of a doorway designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh with a chair to the right-hand side. Put that all together, this is what it looks like. This is truly, excuse me, this is truly the Glasgow style, where you see the carpet, the dress, the chair, the bookcase that you see behind, everything in this room designed by the two of them working together. They were a partnership. Mackintosh said on many occasions, I have some modest talent, Margaret is a genius. Then they worked closely together, so much so that they double-signed their drawings. Now, they knew what was going on in other places. If I show you Aubrey Beardsley and the Art Nouveau movement, they were fully aware of that. They were also fully aware of these extraordinary discoveries in Ireland of original Celtic objects that had been lost in bogs and then discovered. All part of that lost Irish DNA that was coming back through the Abbey Theatre and was reflected in painters in Glasgow like Hornell, who created this extraordinary painting about the Druids. This romantic idea that there was this mysterious spiritual past connecting them to the Celtic kingdoms of yore. And here you see the figure of the chief Druid walking forward, carrying this gold orc. But notice something else about this. No detail can be left untouched. Look at the frame. The frame is as important as the painting. Because if you notice that the orc, this curved piece that the Druid is carrying, is repeated at the top of the frame, the other way. And all of that Celtic intertwining. They looked at all of that, and they decided to make things that were completely different, completely unique, and completely their own. They also began to collect something that was incredibly important to them, as it was to the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist. They started collecting Japanese art. You tie all those things together, and it leads to an incredible series of posters that they designed, the two of them working together. with, as you can see, their own typeface. You couldn't possibly use somebody else's typography. You had to have your own typography. So here you see these long, thin, etoiletted ladies with this incredible decoration tying around them, and then they apply that to large, complex drawings where you see the growth around the figure, leading up through the head of the figure, the sun behind the figure, and then applying that directly to interiors. So here's a tea room designed by Mackintosh and Margaret working together, where those paintings have been re-stenciled and put onto the walls. And you can see the overscaling of these. This image of this figure seen against a figured background like this comes back a little bit later. It's an extremely influential thing. At the age of 27, Charles Rennie Mackintosh won a competition to design a new building for the Glasgow School of Art. It was a whopper, and no one had ever seen anything like this before. It wasn't just that the budget was small and they didn't have any money to do anything, it's just that he didn't want any decoration. He didn't want it to look like a Victorian building. He wanted it to look like something that was going to be appropriate for the new century, because he was building it to be completed in 1897 to 99, just a year away. It had to look entirely different. So if you see it from the front, you'll see something quite remarkable about it. There's more glass than there is stone. The building itself is stripped down to its absolute elements. It's an art school. People in Scotland couldn't understand what he was building up there. They were shocked. There were letters to the editor in the newspaper. What are they building up there? Is it a barracks? Is it a prison? Is it a temple of strange worship? All three. It's an art school. What the people in Scotland couldn't see is that this was a direct quote from their own architectural DNA. They missed the castle references. They didn't see the fact that this was something that they should be familiar with. They were familiar with Greece and Rome and Egypt. They were not familiar with what had been the architecture of their own past. But if I manipulate this slide and take out the two sides and show you only the middle, what you've got is a Scottish castle with a drawbridge, wide steps at the bottom leading to two tiny, tight doors which would easily be protected to keep the Philistines out and the artists inside. Eyebrow windows, and even on the left-hand side of an arrow-slit window, so that the director, because that was my office, could shoot at anybody that was trying to get into the building. The left-hand side of the building, the eastern elevation, is clearly a quotation directly from castle architecture. The attached tower. Think of the buildings that I showed you earlier in these slides. All of that is re-quoted, but also it has an incredibly useful purpose. Notice the low wall at the front. This wall had a gate across it so that it became an enclosure. It was for camels. I'm not kidding. To the left-hand side of this photograph, there was a circus, permanently housed in a building attached to the School of Art. Mackintosh designed this side of the school so that camels could be brought, and tigers, and on one occasion an elephant, could be taken from the circus, brought up the street, put in that enclosure, and taken into the building through a set of double-height doors into the animal drawing room. A double-height room with steel hooks buried in the ceiling from which hung the skeletons of animals and charts of musculature. So that if you as an art student wanted to know, how does this elephant work? Well, there was a skeleton and there were muscular charts. You could look at how that animal was put together. Everything that was done in the building was done, as Mackintosh knew, to help art students do it. No decoration on the building with the exception of the front fence. These steel poles with these strange circles. Well, the circles have been decoded over the years, and they all have a meaning. They're about industriousness. So you have a scarab beetle, a bat, and a bird. There are many more. They're all about saying to the students, if you come here and study, you should be as industrious as bees and bats and birds. You need to be working in this way. Mackintosh had fallen in love with Japan. So where these come from is very interesting. These are called mon, M-O-N. They are the tartans of Japan. No matter what your family, you may be Morikawa, you could be Tushi, whoever you are, you wear, on your kimono, you wear a symbol that shows your family. In the same way that the Scots would have plaids and tartans, the Japanese had these mon. Mackintosh had a book of these mon, and he used them on that front fence to bring that message to students. You need to be part of a clan. You be part of your tartan represents who you are. You need to have the faith in your country, the faith in your clan, and you need to be industrious like birds and animals. Almost no decoration at all. What an extraordinary piece of engineering this is. These are enormous windows facing right into the north for the painting studios. You have to take the pressure off those wooden windows. So he designs here a long steel bar with an elaborate flower form at the top that is then bolted onto the wood of the windows so that when the wind blows, that steel flexes and takes the pressure off the window. It also, as you can see in the reflection, is a flower. And if you look really carefully at them, it's a Scottish claymore sword as well. But notice at the bottom of the flower, there's a little plate. Looks like a little leaf. It's just down here. Why is that there? Well, because Mackintosh is entirely practical. They're big windows. You have to clean them. So tie a plank to those petals, put a ladder on those flowers, and you can get up and down and clean the windows. This level of attention to detail is the message that Mackintosh was sending. It's an ethical as well as a philosophical position. You are responsible as the architect for every detail in the building, everything in the building, from the key that goes in the lock to the front door, which Mackintosh designed, to everything else within the building. It was your responsibility. That is the message that Frank Lloyd Wright heard. That is the message that Joseph Hoffman, Eliel Saarinen, all the great architects of that period heard that message about that ethical responsibility. It was a very difficult building to build. They had to invent some interesting ways of raising money, one of which was to make the students into performers. And here they all are. A Viking festival, student tableau, fundraising in 1898 to allow Mackintosh to finish the building. Led by Francis Newbury, the director of Glasgow School of Art, and his extraordinary wife, Jessie. They used to sell tickets for people to come and have dinner with them. And hundreds of people did this, particularly because of Jessie, who was not only an extraordinarily intelligent, very talented artist in her own right, very beautiful woman, but as you notice, she liked to dress up. They all liked to dress up. So when you came to dinner, you had the opportunity to sit there and have a dinner with Jessie, who, toward the end of the dinner, would undo the buttons on her sleeves, and out onto the table would run her family of pet white mice, who lived up her sleeve. And they would have a little bite of the cheese and then run back. Wouldn't you pay to see that? Wouldn't you? Yeah. Well, people did. And they raised enough money for Mackintosh to design and build the other side of the building. The eastern elevation is about Scotland. The western elevation is about Japan. Because now we see windows that have nothing to do with Scotland. These are tatami mats, the kind of things that you would see in Japanese houses translated in an entirely different way, and instead of being on the floor, now vertical and being windows. Well, people were shocked by the building. They didn't know what to make of it. They were particularly confused by the exterior. But they were more than confused when they looked at the back of the building, which was set up high on a hill and overlooked Glasgow, so most people saw this. Well, this is what they were looking at. And somebody wrote to the newspaper, and I've quoted it here, "Mackintosh should be horsewhipped for shoving his bare arse in the face of Glasgow." But today, if you talk to contemporary architects, it is this elevation of the building that is seen to be one of the most extraordinary things. To have designed this in 1895 was an extraordinary thing. It's architectonic, plastic, cubistic. It looks utterly different from anything that existed anywhere in the world. And Mackintosh designed this specifically so that it would have that kind of impact. This is something new, this is something different, and you'd better get used to it. And when you went into the building, there was a series of vertical rods made out of wood that led you to a staircase that took you up because the light was flowing in. So it was as though you were entering not a building, but a forest. And you were moving forward on a forest trail to these steps that would take you up to a landing that would then take you into a gloriously lit, large exhibition space at the very top with this incredible, elaborate series of beams. And you see a line running around with white walls below. There's nothing like this anywhere except in Japan. Mackintosh had been looking at books on architecture and design and had realized that in the great Japanese houses, particularly of the 1600s and 1700s, the way of building was that all of that activity, holding up the building, in the roof, was all revealed, but below there were these simple flat on which you could hang screens and calligraphy and drawings. And he was copying this way of working in that extraordinary interior. He didn't just learn from books. They were Japanese in Glasgow, lots of them, for a very, very good reason, a rather muscular reason. They were building battleships. This is the heavy cruiser Sazanami. There was another one called Uchida. They were both built on the River Clyde in Glasgow by Scotsmen, and for every Scot working on that ship, there was a Japanese standing next to him, watching how it was done. So the Japanese steel industry begins on the River Clyde in the 1890s, and those men took everything back. But what they brought with them were scrolls, paintings, ceramics. They were religious, so they had Shinto shrines. They brought material, and they donated all that material to the City of Glasgow's museum. Mackintosh met them. He didn't just read from books. He actually met living Japanese and said, what is the meaning of this? How does this work? What is the spirit of this piece? There was an intense and full understanding, the kind of understanding of Japan that Frank Lloyd Wright had too. Here's a tableau by the students, a revelation here. Here they are all dressed up as famous artists. The one in the middle there, of course, is Michelangelo. But look on the left-hand side. Here's Hokusai. This is the painter Hornell, who did the Celtic painting of the Druids, now dressed up as the Japanese artist. So as Mackintosh developed his style within the building, we have these soft, gentle rooms with flowing lines. So this is my office at the Glasgow School of Art. And you see a circular, very democratic table with, of course, one high-back chair to make sure who was in charge. Notice the grid pattern in the backs of the chairs and on the clock, and also in the flying chandeliers that you see. And notice the detail in the door. Here you see a cutout in the door with a stained glass window in the form of plants. And you'll notice that one stalk of the plant is dropped over to the right-hand side, making the letter D for director. Nature outside the informs informs the inside. And notice the number on the door, 41, is, of course, in a typeface that Mackintosh designed himself. So a small, intimate space. And then this was my dining room. Completely Mackintosh scale. Everything here open, wide, beams that are exposed, and incredible fixtures and fittings. An extraordinary fireplace that he made. And again, bringing things from the outside to the inside. Because Scotland's growing season is small, but there are famous Glasgow roses. So he wanted those roses to be an inspiration to students and staff and visitors, even in the depths of the winter. So he turns them into chandeliers and has them fly over your head. An absolutely beautiful, elegant, small room, done almost entirely in white, on the east end of the building. Walk to the west end of the building, and you've got this. The library. Absolutely extraordinary piece of architecture. How like a Japanese house is this? Yes, but also Mackintosh used to go to the cathedrals and abbeys of Scotland. And he would look at the great medieval libraries, the chained book libraries. He borrowed that way of scholarship and joined that to the Japanese way of thinking to create these incredible interiors. Look at this chandelier. designed in 1897. We're 20 years away from the Art Deco exhibition in Paris, and yet he's predicting that way of dramatizing, that way of taking those lovely, flowing, soft, sinuous curves and making them much more machine-like. And in the central reading desk in the middle, it's very Japanese. There's not a screw or a nail in this. It's all taken apart and held together with pegs, as you can see here. And driving a hole through the furniture like that is actually called sukashi. And it's a Japanese technique that you see in furniture making. So while Mackintosh was building the Glasgow School of Art, he and Margaret were having extraordinary success, and they bought a house. Mackintosh actually never built his own house. He would love to have done that, and there were many drawings of what he would like to have had. Instead, they bought a perfectly ordinary Glasgow terrace house and tore out the interior and made this extraordinary and fabulous space with double fireplaces. You can see one to the right and one to the left. One is right, one is white on the right-hand side. The one behind the curtains is a darker gray. And made all the furniture that went with this, of course. So this is one kind of chair that Mackintosh made that was intended to defeat drafts. You know, Mackintosh is Glasgow, a pretty cold, chilly place. But how that looks like something that a Highland chieftain would sit in while sipping his whiskey. Here is an original photograph taken at the time that Margaret and Charles were living in this house. How Japanese this is. Notice the dried arrangement of flowers, ikebana from Japan. Notice the Japanese prints on the fireplace. And notice in the middle, two little tea bowls from which they would drink Japanese tea. Here's a wider illustration, ikebana, and a known Japanese print by Hokusai, which they owned parked on the top. What an extraordinary interior. So utterly different that Glaswegians who came to visit said, what's it going to look like when it's finished? This style of life, this way of reducing everything to its elementals and producing it as beautifully and as simply as possible. Every detail, because that chair, for example, the tops of the chair are decorated, all hand carved. Margaret and Charles did these themselves. How they ever slept is a mystery to me, because they would work for days and days on a single drawing to have something made. And these fabulous interiors, they took out the middle wall and put curtains to act as room dividers so that you could then see the way the space would flow together. Every detail, including, of course, these incredibly beautiful nickel-plated lamp and the desk. Now, this is Margaret's desk. Charles has a desk of his own. And here's Margaret posed in front of the desk. Charles designed the desk. What he would say in his notes was the carcass. He designed the body of the desk. And she designed and made those beaten silver panels that you see on the doors. Absolutely extraordinary. One little detail here is worth noticing. If you look at the bottom of the fireplace, you'll see that there's a cushion. There are two cushions, one on either side. They were for the cats. The Mackintoshes had trained cats, and the cats sat on those cushions, and the cushions were designed to be the same color as the cat. The cats were named, what else? Lancelot and Guinevere. Attention to detail, perhaps at a ludicrous extent, but nevertheless, all tying together to make this incredible sense of living. So that was their living room. This was the bedroom. All in white, as you can see, with a large beaten silver panel over the fireplace. If you turn to the other end of the room, you look at these two incredible wardrobes here. I want to show you how those wardrobes came into existence. In 1896, Charles had been out drawing in the landscape, and he saw a hawk while he was out at Prestwick, and he did a drawing of the hawk. So it shows this incredibly beautiful bird with these very long legs and talons. So he redraws this and abstracts away from it the wing forms and the talon forms and turns it into the pulls of the wardrobe. So it's that way of taking something that is absolutely natural, that is a straightforward representational depiction of the hawk, and then abstracting it into something that is a memory there. And then reversing the colors. So that as you went through the house, you went from light to dark, you went from dark brown to a creamy kind of yellowy tint to the dining room. And this is where nature, again, comes through from the outside to the inside. So in the dining room, there are this wonderful wallpaper. Roses grow on the outside on trellises. But with Mackintosh, the roses grow inside. And look, it's just rained. So the dewdrops and little drops like tears are flowing down through that trellis form. And when you sat around that table and pulled those chairs up, if it was these kind of chairs, then you were having a kind of communion because you created a room within a room. So that when you had a dinner party, you were sealed off within the room, within your own private space around that dining room table. So who else does that? Well, Frank Lloyd Wright, years later. Exactly the same kind of idea. Not because he was necessarily copying Mackintosh, but because they were both looking very hard at the arts of Japan. So you saw that with Mackintosh in Glasgow, and you see that with Frank Lloyd Wright in Oak Park, Illinois. I mentioned the white desk of Margaret. This is Charles's desk. T-shaped desk. Now notice how that T-shaped form is repeated. You see it here. It's a cooperative piece, the body of the piece made by Charles, the inlets, which are mother of pearl, and the rows that you see buried within the middle of the desk, designed by Margaret. So that T-shaped form is repeated again in the fireplace. It's repeated in the doors. And it's repeated in this extraordinary object, an enormous cabinet. And if you look at that form, you see it there, dark wood. Notice the little roses that are panels that you see in the doors. Notice particularly in the very middle, there's a little V shape that you see at the very top, in the middle there. Pretend that it isn't made of wood. Pretend it's made of something else, and pretend it isn't in Scotland. What is it? It's a kimono. Mackintosh owned kimonos. They actually studied how these things were put together. So he was so fascinated by those forms that he began to repeat them. His fame spread everywhere, all over Europe and all over the United States. Magazines like House Beautiful, Homes and Gardens, etc. There were 80 magazines being published in 1900 in Europe, entirely on lifestyle. So if we think that Homes and Gardens television or anything like that is new, it's not. And the news of what Mackintosh was doing in Glasgow traveled everywhere. This is what it looked like. They published article after article after article about him, fully illustrated, showing the way that he made things. And sometimes these were full-color illustrations as color lithographs. That fame became so great that the news of Mackintosh and what he was doing centered on what was then the other most creative capital in Europe, Vienna. And particularly affected one man, Joseph Hoffmann, the founder of the Wiener Werkstatt, who called himself Mackintosh's Viennese brother. And he invited Mackintosh to go to Europe. This was an incredibly important moment in European architecture because all they'd seen were the illustrations. But Margaret and Charles worked together in Glasgow, and they built an entire environment. Then they unscrewed it, put it into crates, and shipped it to Vienna. So it was everything. The furniture, the carpets, the light fittings, and these gesso panels by Margaret. I'm going to show you a detail of this. Right? This is how Margaret worked. These were painted, and then she studied into the stucco pieces of string and wire and jewels. So there are little pearls in there. There are little pieces of jadeite, little pieces of material that she bedded into that so that it's not just a flat painted surface. It has this wonderful texture to it and wonderful luminosity. Well, who did this affect most of all? It affected Joseph Hoffmann and everybody who saw it because they finally saw this is what that integrated Mackintosh interior could look like. But it particularly affected Gustav Klimt. Fast forward 6 years to Belgium, to the Palais Stocklet house, designed by Hoffmann with interiors by Klimt. And look at the wall panels. This is the first iteration of the Kiss. And you see it on the right-hand side. This is how it looks in that house, but you've all seen it, of course, as paintings and posters, etc. This is a direct homage to Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, who showed them how to do that. Well, Mackintosh began to exhibit everywhere. He was in Turin, he was in Moscow, exhibiting work constantly. Very, very beautiful, having a tremendous impact. Their visit to Vienna, they were drawn through the streets in a carriage filled with flowers by the students from the academy. Then he goes back to Glasgow. He starts preparing other drawings for new. He projects this idea of a new concert hall for the city of Glasgow for the 1901 exposition. Fabulous building, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And the people in Glasgow said, "Oh, no, no, no. We don't want anything as silly as that." So they built this. Well, one can imagine how awful that was for a revolutionary architect and designer like Mackintosh to see this replacing his vision of what the architecture was going to be from the year 1900 going forward. But he picks up some small commissions that are quite fascinating. This is the Willow Tea Room on Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow. Interestingly, Sauchiehall means the Street of the Willows. That's the same name as the street on which geisha are trained in Tokyo. So there's a strange little connection that's going on there. Mackintosh's office was round the corner from the Willow Tea Rooms. Every morning, he and Margaret would go over there with bunches of flowers and arrange the flowers on the tables. That pursuit of perfection was that everything had to be absolutely right. So you see here the umbrella stands. You see the wonderful flowers in that hanging basket. You see the stairs leading up to the ladies' salon on the second floor. And right in the middle, sort of toward the back, you see this gridded form. Well, that's this. This is the famous Willow Tea Room chair. And when you went to pay your bill, you went to this chair. There was a small Mackintosh table in front of it, and you paid the lady for what you'd had. The lower part of the chair has a pad, and underneath that is a hinged lid, which is where she kept the cash. So the manager literally sat on the profits. And as a safety feature to ensure that she couldn't be robbed, she was literally sitting on top of a sealed lid. And it's an amazing thing. So what is this called? The Willow Tea Rooms. This is a willow tree in the form of a chair. So you see the trunk going up, and then you see the spreading arms, the branches, and then like all good willow trees, those branches turn and come back down to that green pond that you see. A literal exposition of the title. Right? An absolutely beautiful, extraordinary object. The upper salon was done in silver furniture with purple trim. Everything, of course, had to be right. So, of course, you had to eat and order from a Mackintosh menu. You ate with cutlery that he designed. I think he designed the waitresses, too, because they're wearing jewelry that he designed. Every single thing in that environment was calculated to act together as one holistic form. I think those of you familiar with opera, particularly in Germany, will know there's a word for this, Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, in which everything goes together. Well, the Willow Tea Rooms is still open. And because it's 2018, because it's the 150th anniversary, huge amount of interest in Mackintosh throughout the world. And so you can actually go to Glasgow, and you could have they do have very nice scones and jam. And you can sit in that silver furniture with the grid pattern again appearing through the back, with the pink and purple panels of glass, and all the stained glass restored, and a very nice waitress will come and bring you a high tea. They were also doing one-off items. This extraordinary object, it's a linen press, where you would keep sheets and blankets. It was in a hallway, which was fairly dark, so you see there are two candle holders at the top. The body of the piece, again designed by Charles, but these are inscribed lead panels made by Margaret herself. She was allergic to this material. So she worked on the floor, in the studio, in that house, wearing opera gloves. It was recorded many times that she wore full-length opera gloves so that she wouldn't be affected by the materials that she was working with. This extraordinary object was on the front catalogue and was the poster for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's exhibition that we did some years ago. I was in my office one day, and a touring group came through, and there was a very charming, very elderly lady with them, and she lingered afterwards, and she said, "My name is Audrey Bain, and I'm a doctor, and I'm from Vancouver in Canada." And she said, "But I did my internship here at the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow." She said, "You know, my husband and I didn't have any money. So we went to a sale one day, and we bought a bedroom suite. And we didn't have any money at all, so we didn't pay very much for it. And we knew we wouldn't have much money going back to Canada, so we took it back to Canada." She had the whole bedroom suite by Mackintosh. 11 pieces, including the carpet and everything there, including this incredible piece, which, as you see, is in timber. But then here's Margaret working in tile to create a waterproof surface. So what they designed could look something absolutely modern, and yet again, imagine a Highland chieftain in Game of Thrones sitting in this having a dram. Or absolutely modernist, an entirely different way of thinking of those high chairs. Why are they so high? Because Victorian women wore hats. You had to have the chair have an identity. So the chair had to be high enough for the women's hats to be seen at the same level of the chair. We've dressed people up and measured it. It is actually true. And of course, this extraordinary chair with this natural form of a flying bird coming through the top of the chair. These were done in different scales. Sometimes they were painted white. Sometimes they were black. Sometimes they were dark brown, of very differing scales. In 1904, Mackintosh met a man named Blackie. Walter Blackie owned a publishing company, produced wonderful books. He asked Mackintosh to design the covers of these books. And out of that came a commission to build a new house about 40 miles away outside Glasgow on the River Clyde. Well, Mackintosh designed the house, but in such a way that you couldn't see it. He designed it with an 8-foot-high wall, so that as you went up the street wondering where the house was, all you could see was the very, very top of the chimney pots until you got to a specific place in the wall where you put your head in the noose, and here it is. There's even a little stone to make sure that if you're a little short, you'll be able to do this. Put your head in there as though you were like a gun in an emplacement, and the house is presented to you. So Mackintosh is controlling the way that you approach the architecture, the way that you see it, the way the architecture is revealed to you. Now, look at the elements of this house. Look at that enormous stressed chimney. Look at the disposition of the windows, the armored doorway. Everything else is done in stucco, but the doorway is done in carved stone. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from this. Here's Mackintosh going back to medieval Scotland, looking at the DNA of his own country and borrowing it and replaying it in an entirely new way. Remember the weavers' cottages with the exposed stairwells? Here they are again, as Mackintosh designs the house. So you look at those stairs on the right-hand side, and remember the weavers' cottages. This is where he was borrowing from and uniting things together in an entirely different way. It was an absolutely wonderful house. And the Blackies lived there with their family. They didn't like their children, by the way. So this is the children's room up here. And this is the living room down here, where the parents were. And the only way the children could get from there to here was through this tower, which was locked. So the children were seen at specific times. I interviewed them, and I heard the whole story about this. So here we have a replay of Scottish architecture with an entirely new language informing the way it's put together until you open the door. And when you step inside, you go from Glasgow, Scotland, to Tokyo. A completely Japanese interior in which the detailing of this is a hybrid between those Scottish forms. And one example, the light fittings are Japanese kites. Mackintosh had a book on Japanese kites. He studied those kites and turned them into light fittings. Every detail, from the pendulum clock that we see here, the stenciling, and of course the great living room, which had multiple purposes. So now we talk about one open space and different uses of the space. What Mackintosh did here was take one room and make it into a summer room. That's the part that you see here to the left, facing out into the garden, with tables and chairs specific to that period, compared to the winter part, which is when you would gather around the fireplace. To unite it all, he does something incredibly theatrical. He paints the ceiling black. So it looks like a stage set. And the forms from the garden, the roses in the garden, come through the wall to trellises that we see patterned on the wall as stenciled patterns. That follows through to the light fittings, which look like baskets of flowers. So does the lamp standard. And notice the bookcase, which is a plant. So the plant grows up, spreads out, and the leaves become horizontal bars, and that's where you put your books. And then the upper part is a bunch of flowers stylized. In comparison with that, you then have this incredible bedroom, one of the most famous of Mackintosh's interiors for the Blackies. I have a couple of photographs here showing it under restoration. So you can see that stencil patterning of the roses and flowers from outside, how nature comes through the walls of the house and is with you every day. And this extraordinary set of chairs. They're not really chairs. I think they're like Japanese calligraphy. And here is that chair. I brought it. We have this. I don't sit on it very much, but it's quite a dramatic object, as you can see. There are only two of these. This is a micrometer-managed reproduction. It's absolutely perfect in terms of its copying from the original, but you can see the drama of this piece. So I think this is what Mr. and Mrs. Blackie sat on when they were taking their shoes off at the end of the day. This very dramatic and very beautiful piece of furniture. If you go to Glasgow now, the Hill House is under a tent. 2018 is a time when we're reappraising Mackintosh and his genius and looking again at the condition of all of his buildings. And so the only way to literally dry out the Hill House and do a full repair was to actually stop the Scottish elements getting at it. And the way to do that is to build a tent over it. So they're going to build this thing in the latter part of this year. So even if you go during the winter, you'll be able to walk around the house as though you were a bird walking around it. And all the things that are missing from this house, that have been lost over the years, are being recreated, like this absolutely wonderful garden bench. And this, as you can see, has been made, hasn't yet been stained, but there it is. So this is this extraordinary house. If you look up to the left-hand side, at the very top, you see this wall that is bent here with two shutters. Well, the shutters are concrete. Of course, they don't work as shutters, but they're a memory of what castle shutters look like. But inside, they do work. Remember what I told you about Mr. Blackie? Mr. Blackie was a publisher. Every morning he got up, and he went to those shutters, which were curved, and opened them like opening a book. Mackintosh's reputation went through Europe in an extraordinary way because a man named Alexander Koch in Darmstadt, Germany, launched a competition to speculatively design a house for a person who loved the arts, who loved music, literature, singing, dance, etc. And he published this portfolio. This portfolio not only contained Mackintosh's drawings in black and white, but full-color reproductions. This portfolio was seen by hundreds and hundreds of architects working in Europe and in the United States too. It was an extremely influential. If you had not gone to Vienna and seen that construction, you knew exactly what Mackintosh intended. This was the drawing. It was a big house. And this was going to be for music, theater, dance, and he did one of these things. Now, this is Margaret and Charles working together. So you notice at the bottom, Anfangsraum und Musikenzimmer for singing and speaking, panels won by Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, and then Charles signs on the right-hand side. So you can see how this was put together. These are about this big, and I had one in my office in Glasgow, and I just wondered, what would it look like if we actually built it? So do any of you remember an American accounting firm named Arthur Andersen? Arthur Andersen gave me the money to build it. So here it is. Gives you a sense of what that could look like. The only trouble with this is the chairs that you see here are about 10 inches high. So it's a Mackintosh doll's house. But what if you're rich? What if you're really rich? And what if you really like Mackintosh? Why don't you just build the whole house? So they did. A man named Graham Roxburgh a very, very wealthy man in Glasgow, Scotland, decided to take those original drawings for a house that Mackintosh never built. And 50, 60, 70 years after Mackintosh had done these drawings, decided to build the house. So he took those original drawings, he got a very good architect who was a specialist in Mackintosh, and 10 million pounds later, which I think is probably 17 million US, he built the house. It's pretty good. Given the fact that Mackintosh was not alive to guide this project, he did a pretty extraordinary job. He went through every detail. The panels are exact reproductions. They were hand-carved, exact reproductions of what Margaret had intended for the panels, and he built the whole of the dining room. So this is not a doll's house. This is the real thing, with a working organ at the end. This is now owned by the city of Glasgow. It's incredibly popular for weddings. People now come by the thousands to actually see this recreated, and what an incredible interior. These are pieces of furniture that existed only as drawings in Mackintosh's sketchbooks, but they've all been rebuilt. But by 1914, as we were approaching the horrors of the First World War, Mackintosh had no work at all in Glasgow. The economy was crashing. He wasn't the only architect that was having a hard time. But if you're an innovative, revolutionary architect, you're the first to go. You have to have very, very wealthy clients to be able to build buildings like that, and there weren't any. So Mackintosh left Glasgow. And he went to southern England, to the east of England, to the Fen country, and he went back to doing what he'd done as a child, walk in the countryside and do watercolors. So these fabulous watercolors, of which there are about 60, were all based on things that he found on his country walks and brought back into the house. And notice here how the flowers and the bowl are joined together with an abstract pattern at the background. Because what he now starts to do is to take the natural forms of nature and abstract them in such a way that they could become textile designs. And he developed many of these, possibly as many as 200. We only speculate on this because the company that was going to print the textiles burned to the ground, taking with it all of his original designs. What we have left are the rejects. It's hard to believe that this is a reject, but that's what happened. So Mackintosh's life had this series of terrible tragedies where things just went wrong constantly. Until in 1916, in the middle of the 1418 war, he was given one last commission to design a house in England for a man named Bassett Lowke at 78 the Derngate in Northamptonshire in England. It had a black doorway. So you remember those lovely white, gorgeous, sensuous interiors from Glasgow that were done in creams and greys? Not now. It goes black. And Mackintosh is now using a highly geometric language. So he goes from this, which you saw in Glasgow, to this. And this house has just been fully restored. It's very dramatic. The wallpaper, as you can see, is now geometric. There are no roses anymore. This has become much darker. It's much more anticipatory of Art Deco and of the modernist movement. And he's experimenting with materials. These wall panels, for example, are not paint. It's an American material called Aryanoid. Now, you would know it better as Bakelite. So this was American Bakelite panels in yellow and orange and black that he was ordering, cutting, and then having glued into the surface. The furniture itself also changed. He could never have thought in Glasgow of doing something like this. A yellow couch with a purple cushion, with this incredible geometric. And you'll notice that that's my tie, by the way. So Mackintosh would change from furniture to interiors to architecture to textiles. Well, this tie is that same pattern that you see here in the top. Everything went together. The furniture, this is a smoker's cabinet. The yellow panels that you see here and the diamond shapes that you see in the legs, again, is that American Bakelite. And this extraordinarily beautiful domino clock. Very dramatic and very different way of working. The Bassett Loukes had a guest one night, and it was George Bernard Shaw, the writer, who didn't like anything that he saw and who slept in the guest bedroom. And they said to him, how did you like sleeping in Mr. Mackintosh's bedroom? He said, well, thank God I sleep with my eyes shut. This is where he slept. And yet this is Mackintosh exploring a new language. The linearity that we saw in those sensuous horizontal interiors in Glasgow is now replaced by this very geometric, very machine-like form, where the blue and the black, as you see, carries up through the edges of the chairs, to the top of the chair, to the footboard of the bed, through the fabric, through the pillow, up the wall, through the light fittings, onto the ceiling, and back again. So that same holistic approach was still going on. By the end of World War I, Mackintosh and Margaret were living in poverty in London. They had no income at all. There was a tiny pittance that came from the architectural practice in Glasgow. So they felt they had to leave. They couldn't survive. And so they left and went to about the cheapest place that you could possibly find to live. They went to the south of France. They went to Cannes and Port Vendre, where he returned again to what he had done as a child, and as a student, he started painting the landscape. And these fabulous watercolors, this one is at the Art Institute of Chicago, these gorgeous watercolors sort of reflect what he was doing. So if I show you a 1901 drawing by Mackintosh made in Scotland, and then I show you a 1926 drawing by Mackintosh done in France, it's the same thing. The idea that the hand of humans as they build things that grow from nature, grow from the rock beneath to become the manifestation. An extraordinarily beautiful thing. Mackintosh developed tongue cancer and returned to England, where he died in 1933. The entire effects of his estate were valued at about $200, included all the furniture and everything that they had in storage. There was virtually nothing. Margaret lingered on and died of emphysema just a few years later. But what they left behind were things that he never built. So, models for railway stations. What an extraordinary thing this would have been if he'd built this, and a gigantic one that was intended for Glasgow. And then if things had gone well, if there hadn't been these tragedies in his life, he would have had a wonderful country cottage and studio. And so he left the drawings for it. Well, if you're rich, and you really like Mackintosh, and you're a cardiac surgeon in Aberdeen, you can build it. And he did. So he and his wife built this in the countryside at Farr, outside Aberdeen. It's a very, very accurate reproduction of what Mackintosh would have done. Mackintosh's drawings only showed the outside. So what this doctor did was to spend a lot of time with Mackintosh experts thinking about the furniture, and he did the whole interior too. Another person, an engineer, again, secretly buried away in some glen in Scotland without telling anybody about it, built this house, designed by Mackintosh. And at Glasgow School of Art, they eventually ran out of space and decided that they would build something brand new opposite the Mackintosh building. So they tore up all the buildings that were there, took them away, and built a new building. I couldn't resist showing you this, because now, directly opposite the Glasgow School of Art, is the Nelson Atkins. This is Stephen Hall's new building for the Glasgow School of Art, which opened in 2014. And just a couple of months after they opened this building, disaster. I get a phone call from friends in Scotland saying, go to the internet, get on BBC Scotland, the Glasgow School of Art is on fire. And it was. This was no lightweight fire. This fire started in the western basement and went up through all the floors, which were wood. Now, the outside of the building is stone with elements of steel. But basically, the whole of the interior of the building on the right-hand side was completely lost. And as you see, it went all the way to the roof, broke through the roof, tore into all the other studios, and essentially demolished the entire interior. This is a drone photograph taken a few days afterwards. So it was completely gone. Painting studios, sculpture studios, design studios, all gone, but most of all, the library. So here's the library as it was, and here it is a couple of days after the fire. It was completely lost. Well, they're very smart at fundraising in Scotland. So they did something very unusual. It's quite a brilliant idea. They took the wood, which had turned to charcoal, and they sent pieces of wood to artists all over the world and said, would you make a drawing and send it back? But please, Mr. Hockney, sign it. And they did. Hundreds of them. And as a result of that, this is what that space now looks like. They have braced it back, they have raised an enormous amount of money, and they're slowly rebuilding it. So if you go to Glasgow, and if you're really lucky, you might be able to go to an aircraft hangar at Glasgow Airport and see the library. Because this is it, completely rebuilt. It will now be taken apart, piece by piece, and transported back to the Glasgow School of Art and inserted into that interior. And it will be a, excuse me, perfect reproduction of the original. Now, to do that, you not only need some artists, but you need people who like Mackintosh a lot and people who are prepared to lend their name, and some of them even lend their face. So it's a pretty good idea if you can get Brad Pitt to help. It's also a great idea if you could get an alumnus of the college who's become famous to help, and that's Doctor Who. Peter Capaldi was a graphic design student when I was teaching at Glasgow. And if you want some real weight and some essence of respectability, urgency, need, dedication, then you get Prince Charles. So Prince Charles is now, excuse me, the patron of the Glasgow School of Art, and he comes wearing a hat, and he walks around, and he's very involved, and he lends his name, and he helps very much. So here's Charles wearing a hat, here's Mackintosh wearing his. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're here in 2018 on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's birth, which was today. So I thought, well, where is he? You know, I know he's up there, see? I think he's in heaven. I think he and Frank Lloyd Wright are having a chat about redesigning the pearly gates. It'd be very difficult given that God is your client and that many architects think that they were God and didn't quite work. So this is a celebration of Mackintosh's genius tonight. I'm not the only person who's going to be talking about Mackintosh. Throughout the world, celebrations will go on all year to recognize this extraordinary genius. So I'm glad I was able to introduce to you this Scottish tectonic plate, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Sure, if you can. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have a few minutes for questions. I'll come by with a microphone. Raise your hand. We're videotaping and live streaming, so we want to get the audio on the video.
Excuse me.
I was wondering if he ever spent any time with Antoni Gaudí, who was about the same period in Spain, Barcelona mainly, who was doing very new things in architecture there.
As far as we know, Mackintosh only met two major architects in Europe at that time. Joseph Hoffman was one, and Eliel Saarinen in Helsinki was the other. He may have gone to Moscow. There's a lot of controversy about this. We're not really sure whether he did or not, in which case he would have met Schechtel. But he could not have known about Barcelona. There was nothing published. The issue of who knew about whom is that it was who subscribed to the magazines. I took a lot of time when I did a book on Mackintosh to try to track that down and try to work out who could have known. So, one of the key questions is, did Charles Rennie Mackintosh know about Frank Lloyd Wright? No, he could not possibly have known. There were no publications that featured Wright's work at the time that Mackintosh was doing his work. Did Wright know about Mackintosh? Absolutely. I interviewed Eric Wright, and he told me that the only time in Frank Lloyd Wright's entire professional life when he allowed the work of another architect to be shown in the Wright studios was an exhibition of the work of Mackintosh. And that was at Taliesin. He knew exactly what Mackintosh was doing. I don't think he saw that as competition. I think he saw that as a parallel universe of work where people were in love with the idea of Japan, the idea of a new philosophy for a new century, and putting those things together. But he couldn't have known about Gaudí. Yes, ma'am?
Was Bauhaus influenced by him?
Too late. The question was, would the Bauhaus have influenced him?
No,
It was the other way. He would certainly have, all of that work would be known by Corbusier, and all the people who were working at the Bauhaus all certainly knew about Mackintosh. We know from the Bauhaus archives that they had all the editions of House Beautiful, Homes and Gardens, all the rest of that. All of that material would have been known. So there would certainly have been some influence, but that would have been 10 to 15 years later, after Mackintosh essentially had stopped practicing.
You have a question right
Jan.
here.
Mackintosh's proportions are...
This is always a dangerous moment, but I should tell you. John Bentley has a Mackintosh house here in Kansas City. And the Bungalow Club, which if you don't know about, you should know about and you should join. The Bungalow Club is wonderful, and I've had the opportunity to be able to go to Jan's house, and it is a remarkable evocation. You walk in through the front door, and it's like going to Glasgow. It's just quite wonderful. Anyway,
Thank you, Tony. And
so
the
now you've got
artist-
some horrible questions for me.
The artists who helped me do all that, upgrade the house, are right here with me tonight, these three people.
Well, great job.
Thank you. The question is, you have said that Mackintosh followed the golden ratio, but his proportions seem so different, so can you clarify how that's possible?
Say it the other way around. Where do you think the influence was?
I'm clueless.
All right. I don't know.
Oh,
I'd love to say
you know everything.
No, well, I'd love to say that I know everything, but I actually don't. There's a tremendous amount about Mackintosh that we don't know.
Okay.
And we're still trying to find out. There are discoveries all the time. People will phone up and say, I found this book, and it's supposed to be by Mackintosh, and it's not. But then somebody phones up and says, I found this notebook with drawings by Mackintosh, and it is. And every time that happens, you get some new revelation. Something new has happened. And people tell stories. You talk to somebody. This is my favorite story. I go to interview Miss Newberry. She was 10 years old when the Glasgow School of Art opened. And she walked up the front steps on the morning carrying with a silver cushion that Margaret MacDonald had made. And on the cushion was a key. And it was the key to the front door. And she gave the key to the director of the school to open the front door for people to go in, see? And so we talked about this. And then she said, and that night we went to the theater. And she said, it was so exciting. And I said, what did you see? And she stopped for a long time. And she said, I haven't thought about this for maybe 50 years. She said, but I remember it all. You've just opened a door for me. I said, well, what happened? She said, we went to the theater. So there was my father, who was the director of the art school, my mother, the one with the mice, right? My sister, who was quite small, and me, and we go to sit, and we're going to see a horror play called The Bells, starring the great actor of the day, and it was on stage, etc. He said, and she said, we're sitting down, and suddenly this hand comes over from behind us, and she said, and it's huge. It's this huge hand. She said, it's like a bear's paw. And the hand clamps onto my daddy's shoulder. And this voice says, good evening, Mr. Newberry. And we turn around, and she said, there was this big, big man with a beard, with this incredibly beautiful wife with him. And Daddy stood up and turned around and said, "Oh, my dear boy, how are you?" And big hugs and one thing. It was Bram Stoker. Right? They all go back to Newbury's office at the Glasgow School of Art for a dram, and they start talking. And he says, "Well, how are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm working on things. I'm writing a book." He said, "It's a horror story." He says, "Called The Undead." He said, "But I'm having a terrible time finishing it." He said, I just can't put it aside. And Newbury says, "Oh, well, we have a cottage up near Aberdeen. Why don't you go up there?" See? Mackintosh is in the room listening to this and says, "Oh, I've been up there drawing, and it's quite wonderful, and you should go up there with her." So it's arranged that they borrow the cottage. And so Stoker and his wife goes up there, where he becomes a local celebrity. One of the unusual things about Stoker was that he was the heavyweight boxing champion of Ireland. This is a big man, right? Great big man. He writes The Undead, which he then retitles Dracula. He makes so much money from the book and the successive book, The Lair of the White Worm. He made so much money, he dedicates a prize at Glasgow School of Art, the Bram Stoker Prize for the most original work of art of the year. And I found it. It's a gold medal about this big. Apparently there were 5. I only ever found 1. I'm not sure where the others went. But this one was never collected by the person who won the prize. So, Mary Newbury Stark had not thought about that for 50 years, and suddenly you say something to her about the silver key on the cushion and what happened afterwards, and she said, "We went to the theatre and stopped dead." And that's when it all flows back. None of us had any idea of the connections between Charles Rennie Mackintosh and Dracula. Yeah. So, doors open, pieces of furniture are found, things appear, and it's another little bit of the puzzle. Did he go to Moscow? I'd love to think he did. Did he go to Helsinki on the way to Moscow, which would be the logical thing? Did he really get completely drunk with Saarinen in Saarinen's house at Vitrask? I'd love to think they did. Change the course of architecture. No? Sorry. Okay.
All right, thank you, Tony,
Absolutely.
for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for attending tonight's program. Don't forget, June 21st, we'll be back in Scotland. Same time, Thursday, June 21st at 7 p.m. Thank you and good night.